Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host, Bryan. We're going to wrap up today with a special selection, which is where one of you tell me exactly what it is I need to check out. Today's special selection comes at us from Wormy, John Frusciante's Unreachable, my favorite track off of an emotional and experimental album from the guitarist of Red Hot Chili Peppers. Alright, so let's dive into this. I have never listened to any of John's work outside of Red Hot Chili Peppers, and even that is going to primarily and exclusively be just the big hits. So, let's dive into this. Just one second. Let's dive into this and see what John is bringing to the table today. Really interesting production on this. Vocal is right panned, reverbs off to the left, off weighted by the guitar on the left, drums are center, bass is center. Lots of space between all these instruments. They're very distant from each other. You might even say the instruments have a tough time reaching each other. Really nice bass line there, and it got super funky with that fuzz. Bridging the gap with the harmony. Really nice. Really nice volume dynamics on this. We even have some width dynamics that we'll talk about later as well. curious when this came out. It's gotta be a bit newer, right? There's a lot of older influences in this. I love how the bass volume came up to meet the guitars. Huh. So this song, at least in my mind, exists in two states. We have our first 4 minutes, first like 60%, and then our final 40%, which kind of gets into a bit of a jam element. I want to talk about them separately, and then explore the themes that they both explore simultaneously, to see how it all gets tied up together. Now, a lot of the first section, the first 60% of the track, is comprised of space. Everywhere we can look at instrument placement, which I talked about at the beginning. We have our guitar off to the right. This is my right, but it's reversed for the camera. The guitar off to the right, the bass off to the center. No, the guitar was to the left, the vocals are to the right, and the bass and drums are in the center. That's how it was. And the vocals were kind of echoing off from one side to the other. And it was really the only instrument that was crossing that gap, because not only is everything panned to these different areas, they're very very distant. They don't feel very close to me. They feel like, there's a decent bit of space between me and the instruments. So this creates a further gap between each of the instruments, but also simultaneously, the two that are pushed out to the side are not also semi-centered. And what I mean by that is when you're placing instruments on the x-axis, you have a little dial or a fader or a slider or whatever, that you can put a percentage of a side. So if center is 0 and all the way to the left would be 100, you can put it at 50 and it would feel like it's kind of in the middle, right? If you picture a sphere around you, it would be coming around the bend. It would be sort of in a direction in front of you, but to the right or to the left, sorry. These are 100% out to the side though. So not only do they have the raw distance of just being placed further away from the listener, but they also have that x-axis distance between the other instruments, because there is no crossover into the middle to help them feel like they're closer where it's still in front of you. These are directly out to the sides. And so we have a song at the very beginning that feels very sparse. There's just so much space between each of the instruments. But we also have to look at the volume. By the end of the track, we hit full volume, but it was also for a split second. It was probably a good 30 seconds of the track, so not a whole lot of the 6 minute runtime. Everything prior to that and after that is not at full volume. And this is what I was talking about regarding dynamics. We'll touch on that later. So what ends up happening is the first 3 or 4 minutes, is very quiet. We're about 5 to 10 dBs, decibels on my reading, quieter than our loudest point. Which means there's a lot of space on the overhead and on the outskirts of the band, even further outside than where the instruments are placed. It really feels like we are inside this massive void, and there's just all this space, and then you see these four little instruments, and they're placed around this. You can't even really call it a stage. It's just white, limitlessly, as far as you can see to the horizon. It's just white. And there's just these four little dudes with instruments inside of this massive sphere, and that's what it sounds like. They're so far apart from each other. There's so much room around them. There's so much room above them. It's just exceptionally spacious. And you might be thinking, Bryan, you're spending a lot of time talking about how there's not a lot of width going on. But I think it's very important. The song is called Unreachable to begin with. But beyond that, it is a very clear production choice. I said I wanted to know when this came out. Looks like 2016. Let me just double check that because this is not always accurate. But it's a very clear production choice to make something like this. It is not something you just accidentally do. Okay, so this was 09. Still, quite a bit later. Track 3 off of their 09. So this is quite a bit later than I would have expected given the sounds that we'll eventually hear. But, and we'll touch on that later, because I had mentioned that this feels a lot older than it is. Anyway, it's just a very sparse beginning, and we alleviate that. Around the 3.5 minute mark, we began to, well, somewhere in there, we get a second vocalist on our harmonies coming in behind the guitar on the left side. And so we are beginning to fill a little bit more of the space, and this is actually a trend we'll see as we cross over past the point of the no vocals. We move into what I'm going to refer to as the jam session. It could be called the bridge. It's just, there's a lot of instruments in here, and they're all doing different things. But we begin to stack instruments up, and eventually we get to a point where there's two guitars just going at it. Both of them are doing their own solo-y thing, and their volumes, they start having this battle with volumes until they both reach a point of maximum volume. The bass eventually comes up to this volume as well, as not to be drowned out. Really important. I love that little aspect. It's a small detail, but it means a lot to me. And we're at a point where we have multiple moving melodic elements, which is counterpoint. At the loudest moment of the song, it feels really wide, it feels really full. There is pretty much no more space or room. It is taking up all of that emptiness, and the sounds have found a way to meet in the middle, and they've begun to touch and clash, and it is just a gorgeous rise of opposition of where we were at the beginning of this track. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous contrast. And I don't know what it means. I mean, the title track's called Unreachable, but it could really mean anything, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be reached. But I really love how the music starts out incredibly spacious, and despite our final 10 seconds being incredibly spacious once again with just a guitar and a bass, if I remember correctly, um, up until those last 10 seconds, it is full, the exact opposite of what we had seen at the beginning. Now, this kind of leans into where I was going with dynamics. There's two strong elements of dynamics going on here, and that is volume and width. I'm not going to touch on too much of this, I already talked about it a little bit. We started off a good 10 dBs under our max, and at the end of the track, actually, we were a good 30 dBs under our highest point when it was just the solo guitar and bass, and the bass was actually pushing a bit further down on its lingering tones. Its attacks were about 30 dBs under, but its lingering tones were about 40 or 50. They were getting pretty quiet. Just the gap between the loudest that we can hear a note and the quietest that we can still hear notes is just massive in here. Even if we go just on attacks, we're still looking at a pretty large gap. And I just love that dynamic quality. It makes the song big, right? There's certainly songs you can listen that feel big, but they're always at max volume. It's an auditory trickery, something on the engineering side where they can make it sound quiet without actually reducing the volume. I'm not an engineer; it might as well be magic to me, but I know it exists. There's a lot of songs when I'm watching the audio visualizer, I'm like, we're quiet. This dude's basically whispering, and we're still at full volume. I see it all the time, but this actually uses volume dynamics, which I'm going to hold my tongue on that one. The other one is width dynamics. It is the largeness of the sound, not volume-wise, but spatially, and I think this is pretty easy if you've been paying attention. The song just takes up a lot more space at the end than it does at the beginning and shrinks back down. There's a very large gap between our smallest points and our biggest points. So it's a very dynamic track. We can even look at one more level of dynamics, which is layering, where at the lowest point, which I don't know if we should include because it's 10 seconds at the end, is a bass and a guitar. We have two instruments. But even in some of our more minimal elements, we have the guitar, the bass, and the drums. I think that would be our most utilized smallest section. But as soon as the vocals leave, we end up getting a second guitar, and then we have these ornamental guitars, and there ends up being a lot of layers going on of just sounds, not necessarily notes. I'm glad I said that because I completely forgot about that, and we're gonna have to talk about that too. It's just the timbres going on in here. Um, so yeah, another level of dynamics though is layers. How many instruments are activated simultaneously or playing simultaneously? And we do have a pretty big range on that. I love music that is dynamic. I think it's one of the biggest missed elements in modern productions. So moving from here, I guess we'll talk about sounds, right? As far as my ear hears it, there's four instruments here: vocal cords, guitar, bass, and drums. However, there are a lot of timbres, and the timbre is the unique character or sound of an instrument. It is what helps you identify an instrument. Why you can hear a trumpet and a violin and tell the difference. That's definitely a trumpet, even if you don't see it, because it has a unique timbre. And this even bleeds over into guitar tones. It's why you can tell the difference between Dave Mustaine's guitar tone and somebody else's. Why can't I think of another guitarist? John. Although, at least in this track, I don't think I heard a definitive sound of John's guitar. You kind of played a lot of different sounds, which is what we're going to get into. Um, but the way that people craft their own guitar sound, they're making a timbre for their instrument. and you're becoming acclimated to their specific timbre. So it's just the color, the sound, the identifying element of a sound. And there's a lot of it in here. On his vocals, we end up having the clean vocals that we hear at the beginning, but then we have like a digitized higher pitched one. I don't know if it was falsetto. I don't feel like it was falsetto, but it might have been. It was a pretty high note. It could have been a head voice. Well, head voice is falsetto. Um, then we also had the wavy one, which sounded like a kill switch was being flicked really quickly, where his voice felt like it was coming in and out quite quickly, or kind of wavy, if that's another way you want to feel it, on like 16th notes. Like this is really fast modulation. Um, we eventually also heard this on a guitar. There were also several parts where the guitars picked up these almost like 70s psychedelic, really wide waves. Wah, 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 wah. That kind of idea. Um, and there were probably a couple other guitar tones that I can't think of off the top of my head, but basically what I want to get at is there's a lot of playfulness in the guitar. The drums, very straightforward the entire time. The vocals were functional. He hit notes that were palatable. They were consonant with what was going on. There's nothing wrong with the tonality. There's nothing wrong with his delivery. There just wasn't a lot of playfulness to it. And the bass was sort of the same way. There were a couple of really nice bass lines, but for the most part, it kind of sat in the background and kind of did what a jazz bass would do and lead the band. That led the guitars to have several different effects put on them for different riffs, for different ideas. We ended up having the guitar battle. You can tell he's a guitarist first, is what I'm getting at here. But what that ends up creating is a song that feels sterile and functional on one level and extremely experimental on another, and I really like that. And unfortunately draws a lot of attention to the guitar work, which makes sense. You play to your strengths, right? He's not a bad drummer, not a bad bassist, not a bad vocalist, but they're obviously not his forte. It's not what he's strongest at. His guitar work is solid here, and I think it showcases both ways that he is a strong guitarist in the technical side of it, actually playing the instrument. We heard some nice shredding in here, we heard some really um, emotional riffage, we heard chord progressions, but we also got the experimental rock side of him, where we get to hear how he crafts a tone or a sound with amps and cabinets and stomp boxes and pedals and all sorts of stuff. Um, the modern day guitarist, if you will, who has access to electronics and can modify the sound of his instrument. So we actually got to hear both sides of that, which I thought was very cool. The experimental side and the performative side. In separation, I don't think there was a time when they bled over. He was either being experimental with his sound or he was showcasing his chops. Um, and even that could be seen as a quasi dynamic element of the writing, a variety of ways to showcase one's skill. And so we've primarily looked at the technical elements of this track, though we did touch on the emotion of the opening 60%. What does any of this mean, though? And that's where it's quite open ended. The concept of having space and filling it, the concept of having one voice representing several elements, which would be the one guitar having several different timbres. Um, the pure dynamic of this starting small on pretty much all levels, expanding out in pretty much all levels, and bringing it back down could represent anything. This is one of those tracks that I think is really going to shine through when we hit the lyrics and maybe get a more specific idea of what these vaguer concepts could be alluding towards. I think there was one more thing. Oh, yeah. So I mentioned that this track felt like it was out of time. It came out in '09, but at least to me, it feels like it should belong in the '70s. Um, Well, I should clarify that. The guitar playing sounds inspired by the 70s. Some of the sounds sound inspired by the 70s. The production could even be a bit of a throwback to the 70s. We don't really hear spacious productions like this much in the rock sphere anymore, primarily because we record everything individually rather than simultaneously, where everybody's mic'd up at the same time. The spaciousness of the recording itself is no longer present. Everybody records separately, so that space between instruments isn't there. There's only ever one instrument in the room at a time. Um, and this has crafted a very different vibe of spatialness to recordings. So the production kind of does lean towards an older time, but a lot of his guitar work in here, aside from the more experimental sounds, which I would say kind of have a modern flair to them. But I mentioned that super wavy one, very reminiscent of like a 70s psychedelic guitar sound. And even the way that he riffs, once we got into the solo, or I should say the duet, the battle, the guitar battle, we began to hear a lot of riffs, bends, just general guitar playing that feels at home with the sounds of the 70s. I don't know how old John is. Let's find out. John is 52. So yeah, he definitely would have been around and possibly listening to some of the big guitarists of the 70s and maybe even early 80s, maybe even the late 60s, and would have been highly influenced by them. And you can tell in his playing, he evokes guitarists like Jimi Hendrix to me. There's just a lot of soulfulness and I don't want to say passion because that's like a weird one. That can be construed in different ways. But I'll go with soulful. There's a soulful element to his playing where it's not so much about how many notes he can play or that he has chops, but it's about developing a very specific vibe of narrative. And he absolutely nails it. It is just, he feels like a guitarist at a time. He feels so influenced by guitarists from decades ago, and it shows right here. And I just think that's phenomenal that he can utilize that and pair it with modern techniques, um, and compare it with everything else in here. That I mean, it does end up feeling a bit anachronistic, but it really works. And create something so evocative of, well, at least for me, John. This is a clash of more modern rock with older rock. And it finds a really nice middle point where it isn't really one or the other, it is both simultaneously. And I'm going to associate that with John now. And he just pulls it off so effortlessly. I'm going to hit some lyrics, see what's going on there, then we're going to wrap this up. So this is I'm still trying to piece this together with the lyrics. I mean, with the music. It appears to be about finding separation between others. It's called Unreachable, right? I mean, just kind of going there. I was trying to. I focused in on the line where they say the title, because those are usually pretty good at pointing you towards the thesis of the track. And it's in the first stanza, which I think is really interesting. I'm going to read it to you in full, because I think there's some really neat details in here. Are we down for the same cause? We don't know what we stand for. When the moments start to crack, you do lose track where your head's at, and I'm unreachable. What do you think when your head's full? We don't rely on what we get. We begin now where we aren't yet. And I think this is interesting. I don't quite get it. First of all, we have that really nice interline rhyme. When the moments start to crack, you do lose track where your head's at. And at is a very soft rhyme with crack. It has the same ass sound, but not the same consonant sound after that. So it's interesting that we get the full rhyme in the middle of the line. We end it without. Almost feels like there's a disconnect in the rhyme scheme. This whole section is about not knowing where things are. It just says, do you lose track where your head's at? And in that specific line, we rhymed too early on it. We don't see anything like that elsewhere in here. So I think that's really neat. But anyways, it starts off says, "Are we down for the same cause?" Because we don't know what we stand for, and I've been like trying to figure this one out. If you don't know what you stand for, how can you stand for anything, right? That feels like a non-starter to me. So I'm trying to figure out what he means by that, because it kind of just seems like you're stating the obvious. If you don't know what you stand for, do you know if we stand for the same thing? Well, no. In order to answer the question, we need to figure out what we stand for, and we don't know that. So I don't know. It seems cyclical. But it says that we're unreachable when our heads are full. And then we begin now where we aren't yet. There's just a lot of really interesting ideas in here that I think are going over my head. We repeat a chorus, I suppose we can call it, about uniformity. But uniformity in a group, which I think is really interesting because this reminds me of in groups whose main identity is self-identification, and that is it just does not work. Those run against each other. You can't self-identify as identifying in an in-group. It says spinning the world to the beat of my own drum, a uniform one. Um, you know, it's not really your own beat if it's the same as other people's. And so, like, are we talking about in groups that base themselves on being unique? And if everyone's unique, then no one's unique. And so, what is your group about then? What is it that you stand for if what you stand for is contradicted by the group you're within? I feel like I'm right on the edge. Someone's just got to push me off so I can see the answer, but I'm so afraid to look down. I don't know. Um yeah. The next stanza is about broadening your horizons. You can travel great distances in your mind. You don't know what you'll find when you reach into darknesses. The world's stronger as you start trying new things. Um, and like, yeah, I love this idea of reaching out and connecting with people. And is this supposed to be counter to the idea of reaching out to people who don't know who they are, right? Reaching out to a group of people can broaden one's horizons, but if that group of people are vapid, if they're surface level, if their identity is self identity, you're not going to get anything out of that. So I think this is supposed to be contrast to that. One time, one group of people you could join and make your own drum beat as long as it's the same as everyone else's. And the other group is full of individuals who might not all be about the same thing, but maybe as the beginning states, do all stand for something similar. And through that, you can broaden your horizons. Weirdly enough, though, at the end of this, he says, end, shoot me, end, shoot me, shoot me, shoot me, yeah, yeah, hey, yeah. So I think the general idea here is if you're in an in group and it's surface level, you're not expanding your horizons. You're doing yourself a disservice to be in there. You need to find a group of people who are diverse, who can expand your horizons. and maybe you can ask them to shoot you. Like, I really don't understand that final stance. Somebody's got to let me in on that. There's some stuff in here I'm sure that I've completely missed. Like, I'm still trying to figure out what unreachable means within this context of hive mind groups versus individualistic groups. The whole thing about being unreachable when your head's full. Um, but then it's also about expanding your horizons and filling your brain with more things. And then he says, "Shoot me," and just like I'm obviously missing a key here. I see the locks. I understand the order I need to unlock them in. And maybe each lock holds a key for the next, but I'm missing that first key to open that first lock to really get everything opened up to me. So I reach out to you, unique group of people with several different perspectives on life. Let me know your perspectives on this track because I'm a bit lost here. Those are my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section. Above that is a description box, and there's a link for Linktree. Takes you here. You can find my music, a link to the Discord server, multiple ways to support the channel, and so much more. Go ahead and check it out. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three. That wraps it up for today. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll continue on with this week's theme of one-person projects. Hey, this was a one-person project, wasn't it? Nope. Close. The bassist was Flea. Yep. The drummer is Josh Klinghoffer. Oh, he's the former guitarist of Red Hot Chili Peppers. So this is just a Red Hot Chili Pepper having replaced his friend and frequent collaborator John Frusciante in 2009 after initially serving as a touring member. So this was just a Red Hot Chili Peppers side project. The lead singer was off doing something else, and John and Flea, and they're like, "Oh, let's go get Josh. We got some stuff we want to write, and it's just not RHCP material." Anyways, I'm rambling here. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.